All right, welcome folks. It's good to have you here for lesson 8. This lesson, at least the videos for this lesson, is going to be divided into two parts because we're going to be dealing with an issue that's pretty huge on a world history and certainly an American history phase, and that is World War II. World War II lasted really in terms of the fighting from about 1939 up to 1945, but as we saw in the last lesson, it had been building really all the way up through since World War I ended. This time we're going to talk specifically about what it looked like when America was involved in World War I. America joined a little bit late. The war had been fighting in Europe for a couple of years before America came into the war, and you remember the spark that got America into the war was the bombing of Pearl Harbor by the Japanese. The Americans then instantaneously declared war on Japan, and Hitler, the leader of Germany, then declared war on the United States because he was allied with Japan. So America found itself from a nation at peace to a nation in war with two fronts, one in Europe against the Germans and one in the Pacific against the Japanese. And so we'll see how that played out. The first video here is going to talk about kind of the early efforts in World War II, and then the second one, part B, will deal with what happened as we worked towards the end of World War II. Well, the first thing we had to do when we were bombed by the Japanese in 1941 is really mobilize for war. We had been an isolationist nation since World War I. You may recall we talked a little bit about the fact that there was some question as to whether or not we should have even been involved in World War I. And so the intervening years, the military fell into disarray. It was one of the actual weaker nations of the major nations in the world in terms of its military might. And where Japan and Germany had been strengthening their armies, America had not. So we had to convert our pre-war economy, our peacetime economy, into a wartime economy. And what that really meant was that the industry in America, which was significant, had to start producing arms instead of whatever industrial products they were doing. So a factory that had initially been making washing machines had to be retooled to be able to build tanks, and Ford Motor Company and General Motors stopped producing as many cars and started producing trucks to move troops, those type of things. All that took time, but one of the nice things is America certainly had the time and had the resources. So the industrial might of America, as you'll see, is a critical factor as we go a little bit further into the war. One of the things we also had to produce is something called Liberty ships. Liberty ships were really America's way of trying to support Britain, especially. Britain, you remember, is that lone holdout. The Germans had taken over all of continental Europe but couldn't quite take over Britain. And so we were providing lots and lots of material to Britain through the use of Liberty ships across the Atlantic to try to keep that country afloat while the Germans were attempting to take it over. Another way that we were kind of moving to a wartime economy is we were gathering money by selling something called war bonds, where people would buy a bond from the government. The money would go into creating material for the wartime, and it was a way to kind of show your patriotism. And then the other thing that became really important is that there were a lot of changes in gender roles. Women who had before, for the most part, been at home, taking care of the family and the home, now were asked, as the men were starting to be recruited into the armed forces, to go and build things. And so this is a famous portrait here you can see on the screen on the right-hand side of somebody called Rosie the Riveter, which was kind of the female equivalent of what was happening during wartime for women. And that change in gender role then after the war stayed, and so people could look at women a little bit differently. Well, building a fighting force took some time, as I said. We had to create an army. The pre-war army was very, very weak, and so we had to really bring in brand new recruits, and we did that through something called the selective service, or the draft. So every young man from the ages of about 17 through 35 was given a code as to whether or not they were fit for duty, and then they were drafted as they were needed by the military. Of course, this is also before the Civil Rights era of the 1960s, and so in the armed forces it was actually segregated. There were certainly lots and lots of black troops who fought with great valor, but they were not in integrated units. So there was segregation within the armed forces, black units and white units. Women were also in the armed forces, although they didn't fight on front lines. They did really important things behind the scenes in terms of logistics, and then also, of course, in terms of providing aid as nurses to the wounded. And as I said, we're fighting a two-front war, so we needed to not only build an army to fight the Germans, but also an army to fight the Japanese, and as you'll see, those were two very, very different armies. So let's take a look at the Pacific Front really quickly. This is the battle against Japan. The Japanese, when they bombed Pearl Harbor, they had been for many years kind of taking over the entire Pacific. Took over China, took over the Koreas, and were working their way through the islands across the Pacific, and really meeting with very little resistance. The Japanese advanced all the way through the Philippines, which were at that point an American major base, pushed the Americans out, and almost were to the doorstep of Australia before they finally were able to stop. One of the things that provided America with a little bit of good news in the early battles against Japan was a captain named Jimmy Doolittle and his bomber pilots, who would take these long raids off of islands in the Pacific, drop bombs on Japan, and then land in China. This was a very daring thing to do, but they were able to at least inflict a little bit of pain on Japan as they were inflicting war. And really, because of the size of the Pacific Ocean, the critical importance of aircraft carriers can't be underplayed. The fact that in the bombing of Pearl Harbor we didn't lose any of our aircraft carriers was very important, because without those, there was really no way to get air power to some of the battles. So aircraft carriers, for the first time in war, became a critical component. Looking over at the front in Europe, let's talk a little bit about how things went against Germany. Also, the Germans were, in the early part of World War II, like the Japanese, were pretty much doing whatever they wanted. They'd taken over all of Europe and had really moved down into North Africa. And North Africa became the first major place that Americans joined the fight. The real battle was between a tank commander named General Rommel from the Germans and a tank commander of the United States named George Patton. And that was one of the first battles in 1942 in North Africa, where the Americans saw action. There were also a lot of sea battles in the Atlantic. Of course, we had all these boats going back and forth between the United States and Britain, and the German U-boats or submarines were there to try to knock out as many as they could. So there were lots and lots of sea battles with the Navy in the Atlantic. And then at this time, one of the major things, and we don't talk about it much in the United States history because United States troops were not involved in it, but the Eastern Front, the front between Russia and Germany, was one of the bloodiest fronts, with millions and millions of soldiers and civilians who died. And one of the most famous battles between the Germans and the Russians was the battle for Stalingrad. And if you've ever seen the movie Enemy at the Gates, that depicts what Stalingrad might have looked like. So the Germans, too, like the Americans, were fighting a two-front war, and we'll see that cost them pretty significantly as we look a little further. So what did it look like on the home front at this time? Well, certainly women and minorities were taking on a lot of the roles that white men had taken in the past, and so they made some social and economic advances, some of which they gave back at the end of World War II, but others they kept on, and it really pushed into women's rights and civil rights, and we'll talk about that down the road. We also saw a rise, unfortunately, of racial violence, especially towards Japanese American citizens. So even though they were citizens of the United States, the fact that they had Japanese last names and Japanese ancestry made them a target for people that saw them as a threat. And in one of the darker chapters of American history, we actually round up Japanese Americans and put them into essentially prison camps. They were called internment camps along the Pacific coast, where they were moved from their homes. They had done nothing wrong other than by the fact that they had Japanese ancestry, and they were placed in these camps. So we'll talk more about that later too. Rationing was really important. We wanted to make sure that most of the material that we created went to the soldiers at the front, and so the people back home could only use a certain amount of gas and a certain amount of sugar and things like that. And so in order to kind of augment their foodstuffs, a lot of people would plant what's called a victory garden, a very small garden where they could grow tomatoes and other vegetables to allow for the large production of those things to go elsewhere. So that's a little bit about the early part of World War II. We'll take a look at, in Part B, the kind of later part and the ending part of World War II. That gives you an idea of what things looked like in the first couple years of the war.